Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, May 8th, 2020. A defense of the break that Republicans snuck into the CARES Act. Now, that's the title of an article by Peter Riley, a CPA, published at Forbes.com. The article discusses IRC 461L, which, for most of us, is an obscure provision of the incomprehensible Infernal Revenue Code that doesn't apply to us. However, it does apply to all of us if we want to encourage entrepreneurs to create American companies and employ American workers. This section limits the ability of certain taxpayers to offset gains against losses from other activities to $250,000 for a single taxpayer and $500,000 for taxpayers filing joint returns. A provision of the CARES Act delayed the tax year in which this restriction was to take effect, and thus allows taxpayers to deduct the full amount of losses, at least for their 2020 tax returns. Mr. Riley makes the following points. Much of tax legislation since 1969 has been a war against tax sheltering. The positive side of this legislation is that it gives people work. For this reason, a lot of people who are not really trying to get away with anything dastardly end up stepping on mines that were meant for the scoundrels. 461L was inserted into the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to save $135 billion that was being deducted by taxpayers. Over 80% of the benefits from the massive CARES Act applies to 43,000 returns showing income over $1 million. He gives an example of Charlie, a software engineer who develops a program that he sold to a public company in exchange for $3 million worth of stock. Charlie sells that stock for a taxable gain of $1.5 million to help him finance a new venture. He uses this money to start a new business and has $1.5 million in losses in the first year. Before the CARES delay, Charlie would have been allowed to deduct only $500,000 of his $1.5 million loss and would have had to pay income tax on $1 million of the stock gain. Mr. Riley made a statement that I think most people will agree with, quoting, "I sometimes think that the whole system," referring to the Infernal Revenue Code, "is a sort of white-collar jobs program for college graduates who aren't quite smart enough to be engineers." End of quote. Now, it's interesting that people who don't start businesses but who own company stock were not similarly penalized. If this group of investors sells stock at a large loss, they can use all of that loss against gains on other stock that they sell. So why do the ruling class and their minions in D.C. and the media allow this? Well, as Willie Sutton once famously said about why he robbed banks, well, because that's where the money is. Now, while many of the ruling class are very wealthy themselves, they know that this group of wealthy investors can be controlled by threatening to change their favored status. However, they also know that they have to tread lightly because the holders of great wealth can also fund a tax against them. So it's an uneasy stalemate between the two groups. Using the Infernal Revenue Code to reward their friends at everyone else's expense is a key tool that the ruling class and their minions use regularly. They know that the mere mention of the Infernal Revenue Code causes most people's eyes to glaze over and they just stop listening. In conclusion, it's time to replace the present income payroll tax system with the FAIRtax. Now that's obvious to everyone. Well, that is everyone except the ruling class, their minions in D.C. and the media, and those who Mr. Riley calls college graduates who aren't quite smart enough to be engineers. Now, why should a government policy favor one group of Americans over another, particularly if that policy is not debated in the open, but instead is hidden in the Infernal Revenue Code? Why punish our fellow Americans who earned their money through hard work and not inheritance? Now, no one is naive enough to believe that simply replacing the income payroll tax system with the FAIRtax will completely stop the ruling class and their minions from seeking to reward their friends. That's been going on in governments ever since governments were invented. Mayor Richard Daley was the mayor of Chicago from 1955 until he died in 1976. When the press discovered that a firm with close connections to him had provided him with a lucrative insurance package for one of his sons, Mayor Daley freely admitted it. He said, "If I can't help my sons, then they can kiss my..." Well, you can figure out the rest of what he actually said. Now, while the people of Chicago didn't rise up in outrage and demand the mayor's resignation, the favoritism was at least easy for them to see. Now, wouldn't it be in all of our best interests if we made these rewards more visible and not buried in the Infernal Revenue Code? If we could see the actual payoffs that the ruling class and their minions make to their friends, using our money, by the way, we would have two choices: sit quietly and watch, or rise up and demand an end to it. Now, the kind of transparency that the FAIRtax would bring might not stop it entirely, but at least we would know what was going on. If we had the FAIRtax, the ruling class could no longer bury their hidden payoffs in the Infernal Revenue Code. Now, if you're ready to take a very significant step towards wresting control of your government back from a small group of corrupt people and making it possible for all of us to prosper, then go to FAIRtax.org and join us. Then, contact your member of Congress and the President and demand that Congress pass the FAIRtax, the only truly fair tax.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at FAIRtax.org.